All right, welcome back. Welcome back. The second part of our Unit 0 here is going to be talking about a review of chemistry, okay? Because chemistry is the foundation of biology, right? Um, Anybody who is interested in going into kind of any sort of biology at all, whether it is with plants, with animals, with human beings, chemistry is going to be extremely important to you. Okay. Now, I know that many of us potentially have has taken chemistry before, right? It was my recommendation. I recommend that before anybody takes AP biology, they take chemistry, but it's not strictly required. I have had, and probably will have this year, students who haven't taken or are concurrently taking chemistry succeed at this class. But it's going to be harder for those of you who haven't or that are concurrently in chemistry. Um, you're going to have to learn some things that others in the class might already know much more quickly while you're also looking at AP Bio content. And even if you have taken chemistry before, it might be a while. And I want to make sure to spend some time today and as we go on throughout the year every now and again, to be able to kind of review the most important things that will be necessary for you to be able to know and understand about chemistry that strictly applies to uh, biology in this course. And so that's the first part of today is go over those most necessary pieces that will be used right away in our chemistry of life unit, which is the very first thing that we're going to do. Okay. So as I said, we're studying this. We're taking time to do this because chemistry is the foundation of biology, right? If you go on and want to do something in veterinary sciences or in the health sciences, the medical field, you will have to know a decent amount of chemistry, right? All physiology is based on biochemistry, right? So it is super, super important. And that's where we're kind of starting out with it today. Just kind of review. When you think of chemistry, should think of atoms, right? And so all matter, everything is made up of atoms. And here I've got kind of two Bohr model pictures of a hydrogen atom and an oxygen atom. And so we should remember about atoms and we should remember about protons and electrons. And in the Bohr type model, which is the only type of model that you need to be expected to know for our class, we've got the nucleus in the middle where the protons and neutrons reside. And then in our orbitals outside, we have our electrons, right? And so when I'm talking about protons, neutrons, and electrons, protons are those positively charged particles in the nucleus. Neutrons are the kind of more red one, the neutrally electrically charged particles in the nucleus, and electrons are the negatively charged particles in the orbitals surrounding the nucleus. Now, for biology, we rarely deal with individual atoms. We deal with compounds and massive molecules that are bonded together because of the electrons. Now, the electrons are super important because the electrons determine the chemical behavior of a given element or a different type of atom. So, depending on the number of electrons in an atom's outermost orbit, we call it valence shell, it might behave very differently than an atom that has a different number of electrons in the outermost shell. So, in short, it's not just the electrons that determine the chemical behavior in an atom. Mostly it's those outermost electrons, these 2, 4, 6, 8 in this atom, for example, in their outermost or their valence shell, because those are the ones that participate in bonding and getting two or more atoms connected with one another. So the chemical behavior of an atom depends on the number of electrons in its outermost shell. So on the left, there's 2, 4, 6 in its outermost shell, in its valence shell. And one on the right, there's 2 in its outermost shell. So these two atoms will behave very differently because of that. So here is a short picture, a small picture of elements in the periodic table. And elements in the same row, so these are a row going across, have the same number of shells. So for example, everything in this first row all has one shell or one orbit. Everything in the second row has one, two. See the two blue circles, two shells or orbits. Everything in this third row has the one, two, three shells or orbits. Now, is this going to be technically correct for every single thing on the periodic table? No. But in general, in biology, we're only going to be concerned with the first 20 elements in the periodic table, those with atomic numbers from 1 to 20. And within that range, fairly well, this pattern holds up. If you can see also, as we move from left to right on this periodic table, the number of electrons in its valence shell increases by 1. So here it has 1 outer electron, here it has 2, here it has 3, 4, 5, 6, all the way to 8. Now you might say, well, that your periodic table isn't complete. It's missing the middle section. If you remember from chemistry, it's missing the transition metals, the big chunk in the middle. Now this pattern doesn't continue with the chunk in the middle. The transition metals don't follow this rule. Um, but for our purposes, that's kind of okay because we won't really need to know much about biologically speaking, those elements since they don't compose much of a percentage at all of the atoms within the living thing. So these 20 like I have here, right? Or I guess I ended at 18, but the first 20 elements are really what we're going to be concerned about, and those do follow this nice little pattern. Elements in the same column, so up and down, all have the same number of valence electrons, and so they have similar chemical properties. So, for example, lithium and sodium have very similar chemical properties. So does neon and argon, or fluorine and chlorine. They behave similarly. That's why we call these groups. They behave in similar ways. I'll just click through these animations here. Now, life is only possible if these different elements, these different atoms interacted with one another, if they reacted. So elements tend to complete a partially filled valence shell or empty a partially filled valence shell. In other words, atoms are, in the most part, most energetically stable if their outer shells are full of electrons. And for our purposes, for those first 20 elements in the periodic table, that means 8 electrons in their valence shell. Because they want to be the most stable, they want to have a full outer valence shell. That causes them to undergo chemical reactions to create bonds because creating bonds allows them to fill their valence shells. Now, in biology, there's a number of different bonds that are going to be important for biochemistry. Weak bonds, like hydrogen bonds, or hydrophobic or hydrophilic interactions. It's okay if you don't know what these ones are. We'll talk about these later. Van der Waals forces, ionic bonds, and then stronger bonds, like ionic bonds and covalent bonds, that are much more stable. So, for example, here's a covalent bond, and we're going to talk about this type of bond next because it's probably the most common. So why is a covalent bond a strong bond? Well, a covalent bond occurs when two atoms share electrons, and both atoms hold those electrons. And since those electrons are being attracted to both atoms, it holds the atoms together to form a molecule. So, for example, here are two hydrogen atoms. The nucleus of each hydrogen atom of each atom is positively charged, right? Because there's protons, which are positively charged, and neutrons, which are neutrally charged in the nucleus. And so the nucleus overall is positively charged. And each of those positively charged nuclei from the two hydrogen atoms are attracted to these two electrons. They both kind of are pulling on them. And so, since both of them are pulling on these electrons, they're held together like this by their mutual attraction to these electrons in the middle. And that forms that bond, that mutual attraction between their two nuclei and these electrons shared in the middle. Anytime you look at, for example, a chemical formula or a Lewis structure like this, and you notice this line connecting the two symbols of the elements. This line represents a covalent bond. So anytime you're looking at a diagram, these straight lines represent covalent bonds. Here is a molecule of water that has two covalent bonds, right? Notice this oxygen now has one, two, three, four, five, six, seven, eight valence electrons. So it is as stable as it can be. And each hydrogen has one, two, one, two. Now, hydrogen and helium only want two in their outsider valence cell, so they're stable as well. So this picture of water depicts the one, two covalent bonds, and as a result, the stability of each of the three molecules. And here is, like I said, a formula, a drawing of water, and each of these two lines right here represent these two covalent bonds. Now, obviously, you can form more than one covalent bond between any two atoms. So you could have a double bond where two pairs of electrons are shared. You could even have a triple bond where three pairs of electrons are shared. Now, obviously, the higher bond order, double compared to single or triple compared to double, is stronger. So a triple bond is an extremely strong bond because there are three pairs of electrons being shared between the two atoms, and that's very, very difficult to break. All right. The next thing we want to talk about is how covalent bonds can be more polar or more nonpolar. Now, usually we see drawings like this on the bottom, where these electrons are kind of midway in between the hydrogen and the oxygen atom. They're sitting right there in the middle. But this usually isn't the case. Pairs of electrons are usually shared unequally by the two atoms, meaning they're usually closer to one rather than the other. Okay, so while this picture might be nice to get the concept of a covalent bond, it isn't very accurate because really, if we really were able to see the electrons and where they would on average be much closer to the oxygen and much farther from the hydrogen. They're kind of being hogged more by the oxygen than the hydrogen, just if like you had a sibling and you technically we were sharing something, but your sibling hardly ever got to use it and you used it all the time. Sure, you're sharing it, but it's not an equal sharing. Now, this unequal sharing happens, for example, between hydrogen and oxygen, because oxygen has a stronger attraction, for example, for the electrons than hydrogen. It wants to pull them closer to itself than the hydrogen does. And we call atoms that have a tendency to pull electrons closer to themselves than the other atom, or they have a stronger affinity for these electrons as highly electronegative. So electronegativity is a measure of how strongly one atom wants to pull electrons towards themselves, right? So we call water a polar molecule because this oxygen atom is pulling these electrons that it's sharing in its covalent bonds with these two hydrogen atoms closer to itself. So these electrons are closer to the oxygen in this bond than they are to the hydrogen. If we're going to draw them out, maybe realistically, maybe instead of being halfway in between here, maybe they'd be all the way over here. Okay. Now, if these electrons are closer to the oxygen, these electrons are negative, this oxygen atom is going to be slightly more negative because it has slightly more electrons closer to it than the hydrogen atoms. And these hydrogen atoms, since the electrons are on average farther away from them, these hydrogen atoms will be slightly positive. And that's what these symbols mean. The Greek letter delta with the minus and the delta with the plus means that because these electrons are being pulled closer to the oxygen, the area here where the oxygen is slightly more negative, and the area where the hydrogens are slightly more positive. Okay. Now, because of that, I can divide or draw an imaginary line right through this water molecule, and I can separate it into a negative portion or part and a positive side or part. Like if I went straight across like this, right? Negative part, positive part. That's what we call a polar molecule. And a molecule is more polar if it's more easily able to be separated into a positive part or side and a negative part or side. So water is a polar molecule because we can, due to the electronegativity difference of oxygen and hydrogen, we can separate it into a positive side and a negative side. Now, in class, in our chemistry review activity, you are going to learn about how to identify which atoms are more electronegative and which are less electronegative. Okay. But this key idea is what is going to get us started on the way to talking about the properties of water, which is the first thing we're going to do in our chemistry of life unit. Hydrogen bonding, which is a type of bonding you might not have been familiar with, exists in all different types of organic molecules. And it's created when the negative part of a polar molecule is attracted to the positive part of another. So, for example, in this picture, remember the hydrogen sides of a water molecule are slightly positive. And because they're slightly positive, they are attracted to negatively charged things. And so the positive part or side of one water molecule is attracted to the negative part or side next to the oxygen of a second water molecule. And we call that an attraction, a hydrogen bond. Now, they're not as strong as covalent bonds or ionic bonds, right? But they are still an attraction, right? And usually in pictures, dotted lines will represent these hydrogen bonds. Now, a common question is, do hydrogen bonds always need to take place between hydrogen and oxygen? And the answer is no. They A hydrogen bond can take place between one positive part or side of one polar molecule and the negative part or side of another polar molecule. It doesn't strictly need to be hydrogen and oxygen, even though those are very common ones you'll see. As we get into farther into our chemistry of life unit, you'll see that hydrogen bonding does not always have to occur between hydrogen and oxygen. It's more between a positive part and a negative part of two different polar molecules. All right. So That is going to be it for today. Just a little bit of a heads up or review on chemistry. Now, I know after this, there might be some of you who are feeling a little overwhelmed, specifically who haven't taken chemistry before. And to those, I would say, we're going to be going through this in class every day. So don't freak out right away. But also, if you're concerned, I would suggest stopping by one of my A pluses in the first couple weeks of our unit because I can help you in pretty short order get the things figured out that you're going to need to know for AP Bio. Because to be honest, everything that you might have learned or not learned at this point from chemistry is going to be relevant to our class. And so it's not, oh my gosh, I have to teach myself or I have to learn a whole year of chemistry, on my own. That's not true at all. But there are things that you're going to really need to know that's going to dictate your success in our class, in especially the first unit and as we go. And I want to help you out to do that as soon as I can.